All right, so I'm going to frame the way I think about misinformation might be slightly different, I think, than how some of the field does. And this is so my inspiration, like for my initial interest in this, was actually a little ways back in the innocent days of the 2004 presidential election. So I was in college at the time, so this video.
About what John Kerry's made up, just spend 3 minutes with the men who served with him 30 years.
I served with John Kerry.
I served with John Kerry.
John Kerry has not been honest about what happened in Vietnam.
He is lying about his record.
I know John Kerry is lying about his first Purple Heart because I treated him for that injury.
John Kerry lied to get his Bronze Star. I know. I was there. I saw what happened.
His account of what happened and what actually happened are the difference between night and day.
John Kerry has not been honest, and he lacks the capacity to lead.
When the chips were down, you could not count on John Kerry.
John Kerry is no war hero.
He betrayed all his shipmates. He lied before the Senate.
John Kerry betrayed the men and women he served with in Vietnam.
He dishonored his country. He most certainly did.
I served with John Kerry. John Kerry cannot be trusted.
Swift Boat Veterans for Truth is responsible for the content of this advertisement.
All right, so this is a pretty devastating ad, especially 2004. Anyone who was alive and aware in that at that time, like this was during the Iraq War, patriotism was a big thing. But the thing is, like, even though it sounds pretty compelling, actually the newspapers that investigated this found that these charges really weren't true. We had quotes from the LA Times, the New York Times, and basically, from what I understand, these weren't people who served directly with Kerry. They were maybe in Vietnam at the time Kerry was. But the point was, like, it was really misleading, and they basically had political access to grind against him, and they made it look like he was dishonorable. So, despite the fact that they were totally untrue, these ads were highly effective. And I remember reading in Newsweek magazine, which at the time was a major news weekly magazine in the US, they really portrayed those ads as a turning point. And I dug this up again more recently, even though Newsweek isn't really a very prominent magazine anymore. Basically, they said Kerry wanted a forceful response. It's a pack of effing lies, what they're saying about me. But his top strategists disagreed. And they were like, to respond to the ads would be to dignify them. They were stirring up Republican true believers, not winning over undecided voters. And the thing is, at least at that time, there was actually research consistent with his advisors' instincts, where responding risks amplifying a false narrative in voters' minds. Now, my understanding of the research landscape today is like, maybe that's not actually as it's not always the case, I think. But I think there are still some cases where it is. But the point is, like, at least at the time, that was a limiting factor. But then it's like, okay, so the fact that he didn't respond ended up being really bad. If he had responded, that also could have been bad. So that's like, well, wait a minute. Does that mean that if a candidate is willing to lie all the time about their opponents, like, they'll be an unstoppable political force? Well, I guess we've gotten the answer to that, unfortunately. So since 2016, when said candidate first got elected to be president of the United States, misinformation has been a growing area of research. And again, I felt like even at the time, I was like, well, psychology is needed to really address this. And there is some work in psychology, but I feel like one flaw in some of that work is that a lot of these studies measure explicit belief in or decisions to share false content. And so, I mean, I think that's important. That's definitely a piece of the story. But I don't think it's the only outcome that we really care about. So I think it's important to measure opinions about the targets of disinformation. So, like, politicians targeted by smears, climate change interventions, vaccines. So I examined effects of derogatory information on impressions of mock political candidates. And the first piece of this at least focused on continued influence effects. So this is something that's been established in the literature for a while now, but it really shows the limitations of fact-checking. So we know that fact-checking false content definitely helps, but ideally you would think the impact of false information would be erased if it were fully corrected. But that's not really true, and continued influence effects represent the degree to which that's not fully true. So the first study that I did on this, one major focus was individual differences in continued influence effects, and we thought that would be helpful for determining when fact checks are going to be the most useful. But then another thing that I look at is inoculation. And that's been one of the most promising available approaches to help people resist false information. A lot of that work has been done here at Cambridge by Sander van der Linden and his group. So there's a couple of different ways of doing this. So one is gamified training. So they call it the bad news game and some other variants of that. YouTube videos, and so kind of that's sort of a slightly different approach, but with the same idea. That basically, you're teaching people to some of the techniques that people might be using to mislead you. And actually, I also realized, I think a couple of the other people who have been involved in that work, the key people are also in this room, and John Riesenbeek, Steve Landowski. So this group is definitely the place for inoculation. And so yeah, so this is one of the more promising approaches for addressing misinformation. But one thing that I felt like was a limitation is that a lot of the validation studies focus mostly on whether training increases the likelihood of identifying manipulative techniques, but it didn't really look at the effects on opinions after that. And actually, some work has questioned how effective inoculations actually are at making people's opinions immune to false information. So there's been a couple of studies where the effects were minimal, or they really didn't find any benefit of inoculation there. So I looked at it in the context of these stimuli that I had developed to look at continued influence effects on mock political candidates. I wanted to see, would inoculation affect people's ratings of those candidates? And so again, we used these mock candidate stimuli. These were based on real candidates and real accusations, but because their identities are obfuscated, you don't have already formed opinions about them. And then there's 27 or 36 candidates in different versions of the stimulus set, and then each one's shown in the form of either corrected accusation, uncorrected accusation, or no accusation. So the first part, and this, so the QR code is for the paper that we have that's out. So that was where we looked at the basic effects and individual differences in continued influence effects. That was based on 2 studies run online. And then the second section, these are the cognitive inoculation interventions, mostly from Sanders' lab. The third part is a socio-emotional inoculation. It's kind of a different approach that I actually realized kind of recently that actually kind of follows a new line of research from another lab called bypassing. I think kind of a similar mechanism. So I'll talk a little more about that later. But and that's still a little less. The results are a little less clear on that, but I think it's still a really interesting approach. So just to give you an example of the stimuli. So you see basic information about the candidate. And then you can see an accusation. You see 2 articles about the candidate. You see an accusation. So in this case, this is based on the mayor of San Juan, Puerto Rico, saying she stole money intended for hurricane victims. If you're in the corrected accusation condition, you did a refutation. And let's see, I'm looking for a pointer. But all right, well, if you look closely, I don't seem to have a laser pointer on here, or I can't find it at least. If you look closely, the refutation is supposed to be from an authoritative news source. It has a blue check mark, and where the accusation is not. So we hope that helps so basically kind of do best practices for the refutation. And then in the uncorrected accusation condition, there's a control stimulus that looks like the refutation, but doesn't actually refute the stimulus, or doesn't refute the accusation. And then there's also a no accusation condition where you get 2 control stimuli that again are matched to the accusation and the refutation, but don't actually make the accusation. And then the key dependent measure is this feeling thermometer rating. So it's just like, on a scale of 0 to 100, how do you feel towards this candidate? I will say, actually, we did also, I don't actually cover it here, but we did also do, at least in the earlier set of studies, this mock vote choice, where we paired up different groups of candidates, and people had to choose who they would vote for, and those show pretty consistent results with this measure. And it's actually, I like that measure, but it's just kind of a pain to deal with, so we ended up cutting it from some of the later studies. But it does correlate with this feeling thermometer rating. So first the baseline effects. So we do get robust effects of accusations on candidate ratings, both immediately and after a delay. So uncorrected accusations, the blue bar, should show lower ratings than no accusations, and you do see that. Corrected accusations should have comparable ratings to no accusation candidates, at least ideally, But again, you don't see that. And that difference between the red bar and the beige bar, that's the continued influence effect. And we see that really consistently and robustly across all the studies that I've done with these stimuli. We also see similar effects for delayed ratings. They're a little bit smaller, but you clearly see relatively big effects for the uncorrected accusation, and then also smaller but still reliable effects for the corrected accusation. So again, those do hold up after a delay. And we even actually did it, so this was like a 20 or 30-minute delay. We also had somewhat a longer delay, and it holds up there as well. So individual differences. We found that people who self-report relying more on intuition show bigger continued influence effects. So in this graph, negative is a bigger continued influence effect, where 0 is where you don't have that, would be the baseline. So faith and intuition is associated with a larger continued influence effect. Digital literacy is associated with a smaller continued influence effect. And there were a few questions about factual knowledge about social media platforms. And then finally, old age is associated with smaller continued influence effects, which I don't really talk about the rest of the way here because I don't really have any more data on it beyond this. But I do think it's a really interesting question, so I'm happy to answer more questions about that because I've done some aging work in the past. And again, I think there's some interesting questions or issues about why that is. But ultimately, it seems like being more analytical helps people incorporate corrections to false accusations, and that's consistent with the factors that predict people's ability to correctly identify false headlines. And then I also just want to make clear, so these were done over 2 experiments, so we replicate all of these effects across both of the experiments that we had. Another typical finding is that Republicans are typically more likely to believe false information than Democrats. So the misinformation susceptibility test, or MIST, which is also from Sanders' lab, that shows this effect really strongly. But the thing is, despite the effects on the MIST, which you see in the green lines here, there's really no effective political party on continued influence effects. And so that argues against the idea that there's different thinking styles or maybe more gullibility among Republicans, and maybe more consistent with the idea that there's differences in the information environment that lead to the effects on the MIST, but when you actually present everyone with the same information and there's no external context, maybe Republicans don't show this increased vulnerability. So to summarize this section, so accusations continue to worsen impressions of political candidates even when they've been factually corrected, so that's saying that continued influence effects are robust. There has been some prior work, we're not the first ones to show this. There was a paper by Emily Thorson that showed this previously, although I do want to say there's some more recent work from Ulrich Ecker's lab in Australia that actually did not find continued influence effects on social impressions for ordinary individuals. And so it's an interesting contrast there because they've shown those effects pretty consistently. So it's not clear if the difference is because they used ordinary people and we used political candidates, or also they presented their stimuli more like a kind of classic cognitive psychology paradigm, where ours was kind of supposed to be more like a social media context. So that might be a key difference. Not quite clear, but we do get it robustly here. And then again, we get these consistent individual differences in who's most vulnerable to the continued influence effects, people who are more intuitive, lower in digital literacy, and young people. Okay, so those are the basic effects. So now, how do inoculation interventions affect people's ratings of candidates? We can look at it both on reducing the impact of uncorrected accusations. So these are accusations that are unverified but not actually refuted. And then we can also look at it on the impact of corrected accusations. So that's like, does it benefit you beyond fact-checking to take you closer to that ideal of like the false information not affecting your judgments? And then we also looked at effects of inoculation on both immediate and delayed ratings. Okay, so this is an example of the inoculation video from Sander and Steve Lewandowski and their team, and John Rosenbeek and their whole team. They did a really good job with these. But yeah, so I'll show you an example of this.
You might think about skipping this ad. Don't. What happens next will make you tear up. Wait, you're still here? I mean, great, looks like the trick worked. You see, when watching videos or browsing online, you are likely to encounter content that is loaded with emotional language, and with good reason. Playing into emotions, especially negative ones, such as fear, anger, or contempt, is a trick to get you to pay attention to something when you otherwise wouldn't. It's likely that's a big reason why you're still watching this ad, is because you were lured in by our use of emotional language in the very first sentence. Research has shown that expressing emotion is key for the spread of moral and especially political ideas in social networks. So let's say when you're writing a headline and you're trying your hardest to manipulate your readers to click, one thing you can do is pepper your headlines with a bunch of emotionally charged words. Call it a horrific accident instead of a serious one, a disgusting ruling instead of a disagreeable one, or a heartbreaking twist of fate instead of an unfortunate coincidence. That way, you're likely to reach more people and influence their reactions. So let's see how this plays out in real life. Let's take the following headline from the movie Anchorman. No emotional manipulation at play here, just to the point, no-nonsense coverage of such an important event in history. This headline, on the other hand, see what they did there? The writer used an emotionally charged word like revolting to describe a whole group of people. Are mutants people? Oh well, you get the point. They're fear-mongering. So whenever you feel outraged or angry, remember, someone may be pulling your strings. Don't be manipulated. Truth Labs, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
All right, so you did an idea kind of what people saw, and I think what's fun about these is like, it's not just a dry video, but kind of uses high production values and humor, and so hopefully it really kind of sticks in people's minds. And okay, so what I'm going to report, I actually did multiple experiments in trying to use these, and which is so basically we were kind of trying to nail down like, okay, what's really the right way to do this? It ended up that the effect sizes were pretty heterogeneous, and we didn't really get a clear explanation why. But what I ended up doing was combining all of the data in an internal meta-analysis, and we actually did get some relatively clear results when we did that. So basically, because we're including everything, we don't have selection bias. So even though it's a small and variable effect, we can see what actually seems real. And so in total, though, we had like over 6,000 participants in these studies, all doing like 45 minutes, half hour to 45 minutes of study on this. So, okay, so this is one experiment, though. This was the one that probably showed the best results. So I just want to show that before I go to the plots that kind of are more summary of everything. So just so you can get a kind of better idea of exactly what it looks like. Okay, so the inoculation intervention reduced the effects of uncorrected accusations. You can kind of see that. So again, the difference for the blue bars versus the yellow bars, and the difference between, so the cross-hatched ones are the inoculation condition, the solid bars are the control condition, and yeah, so basically the effect of the uncorrected accusation is reduced with the inoculation because the ratings go up with the inoculation. We also see that at a delay, it's a little bit of a smaller effect, as all the delayed effects are, but it seems like it is still effective, which is nice to see. And then the inoculation also does seem to reduce effects of corrected accusations, at least for immediate ratings, but it's a pretty small effect, and that was one especially that was kind of inconsistent. But there's some evidence that it helps even for corrected accusations. So relative to candidates with no accusations, so now I'm just going to go through all of the effects across all of the studies. So these are the main effects. This is just like what I showed in my earlier studies. What happens on uncorrected accusations? You see a decline in ratings. No real surprise there. It's on average 23 points. So these are unstandardized because the dependent measure was the same in all the studies. So decline of about 23 points. On corrected accusations, we also see the continued influence effect pretty robustly. It's a decline of about 6 points. These effects were pretty consistent across studies. Now, the effect of inoculation on immediate ratings. So the most consistent effect of inoculation was on the uncorrected accusations. And it seems like that weakens the effect of uncorrected accusations by a little over 3 points on average. The effect on corrected accusations, again, so we kept getting where like it was significant in one study and then not in the next, and then it was and it wasn't. So, but if you average it all together, this is a significant effect, but it's pretty tiny and kind of inconsistent. So this, and again, this is the degree to which the inoculation goes above and beyond the impact of a fact check. Now, we'll also look at delayed ratings. So relative to candidates with no accusations, delayed ratings decline after uncorrected accusations. Again, that's the same as what I showed before. This is just the main effect. And then they also decline after corrected accusations. That's your continued influence effect. And these effects, again, the main effects are pretty consistent across studies. But then when you look at the inoculation, so the inoculation does reduce the effect of uncorrected accusations after a delay. And again, it's a small effect. It's kind of inconsistent, but it does seem reliable when we combined across all the studies. And again, that's good because that says it is robust even over time. It's short duration, and there is a booster inoculation, which I'll talk about a little more in a second. But yeah, and then if you look at effects on corrected accusations at a delay, there is a trend, but that one's not quite significant even with our 6,000 subject combined sample, so we can't be really sure about that. But ultimately, it seems like inoculation does reduce the impacts of accusations on candidate impressions. There's a clear reduction in the impact of uncorrected accusations. There's a small reduction in the impact of corrected accusations. These do seem to persist even after a short delay. But I do want to say, so the authors who made the inoculation, they actually also had a booster form of the inoculation that was like a short version that people could see later. And so I presented that before people gave the delayed ratings. So this is maybe kind of the best case scenario. And the effects are still pretty small after a delay, but I think it's interesting that, okay, at least in the best case scenario, you do still get the effects. So I think this is good news overall about inoculation. So it can help people to be less influenced by both unproven and by explicitly refuted accusations. Okay, so now the last part I'm going to go into. So this is whether it's effective to, instead of just teaching people how to resist these techniques, what if you inoculate people by making the targets of false accusations more likable? So I think this is interesting, partly because it could fit in with what political campaigns are already doing. Like, it might be a little weird for a political campaign to do something like the video that I showed you before, but here it's just like, okay, like if you think your candidate is going to be facing a liar in their upcoming election, like do really like warm, soft focus ads. Like, I think that's an actual like usable strategy for political consultants to do. And I don't know if I have enough evidence to definitively make that recommendation yet, but that was the hypothesis, and there's some evidence that it was correct. But as I'll show you in a second. And then again, so the inoculation here is connected to specific targets rather than the broad spectrum inoculation that we used in the previous section. And again, I just recently became aware of the similarity to this work on bypassing from Dolores Albarrachin's lab at Penn. So basically what they do there is like they want to counter effects of misinformation on attitudes. So they looked at genetically modified foods and other kinds of things where like basically if you're having positive misinformation, they would give you something negative beforehand, and vice versa. It was negative misinformation, they'll give you something positive beforehand, and it reduced the impact of the misinformation. But as far as I know, it hasn't been tested on political candidates, but I think that's a good body of literature to tie in with what I'm talking about here. So we created modified versions of the introductory bios to try to evoke empathy. And so you see the original one versus the inoculation one. So the inoculation one used like first-person narratives for what was underlying their policy positions. We also used AI to generate warmer smiles. And part of the inspiration was also, so I don't know if people are aware, so Alyssa Slotkin, who's now a US Senator from Michigan, but she originally ran for Congress in 2018 in the first anti-Trump wave. And she talked really compellingly about how she was motivated to run for Congress because her Republican congressman, when they tried to vote to repeal Obamacare, he was celebrating at the White House, repealing Obamacare, and her mother suffered in the last months of her life fighting with insurance companies, and people like her mother were so helped by Obamacare, and she did not want to see Obamacare repealed because she wanted to help people like her mother. And so this like very personal narrative I thought was a brilliant piece of political messaging, and so I think that kind of inspired some of the approach that we used here with this intervention. So again, we had the same set of stimuli. You've already seen this a version of this before. Corrected accusation, uncorrected accusation, or no accusation. Do the feeling thermometer rating. We had 4 studies on this where we varied a few different features. The one that ends up really being potentially key is whether it's within or between participants, so whether people see some of the candidates in the standard condition and some in the inoculation condition versus seeing all of the candidates in one condition or the other. So we did the manipulation check. It turns out the between subjects version did not work, so people actually do seem to need to compare, like seeing some that are more soft focus and some that are like more kind of like straight down the middle. And so but studies 1, 2, and 4, where it was manipulated within subjects, those all do show an effect that basically the initial ratings are higher when you've gotten the empathy bios. So we ran a meta-analysis again. So we left out study 3 because the manipulation didn't seem to work there, but we included study 1, 2, and 4. And okay, so I'm going to go through it the same way I did before. So again, we get the basic main effects, lower immediate ratings after uncorrected accusations, lower immediate ratings also after corrected accusations. So again, these are just the main effects of the accusations on the candidate ratings. Now, the effect of inoculation, so this was a little bit weird. So it seems like it's reducing the effect of uncorrected accusations on the candidates, so that's a good thing. It's a little weird because study 4 was supposed to be an exact replication of study 2, and the effect got a lot smaller there. And so this isn't quite significant even though study 2 was a really big effect. So again, we'd need more data, I think, to really nail this down, but it does seem like there is a benefit, again, for uncorrected accusations. You don't really see any effect of this inoculation on corrected accusations, though, so that's different than what we saw in the previous section. Now, also, if you looked at a delay, again, we see the main effects of the delay of uncorrected accusations, corrected accusations. The effects are kind of smaller for corrected accusations here. I'm not really sure why, but they are still there when you do the meta-analysis. But then the effects of inoculation on delayed ratings. So it looks like there actually is a small but significant effect of inoculation on delayed ratings for the candidates with uncorrected accusations. There's no effect of inoculation on the corrected accusation candidates. So again, what we saw on the initial ratings, if that is a real effect, that seems to hold up at a delay. I mean, it's not a huge effect, but that one is significant with the meta-analysis. So to summarize this part, so the socio-emotional inoculation does seem to make candidates less vulnerable to the impact of uncorrected accusations. So these benefits also do seem to hold up after a delay. There's also no booster needed in this case, which is interesting. The statistical evidence is not entirely dispositive, so ideally we'd get more data on this. There's also no apparent benefit for corrected accusations, so liking the candidates doesn't add to the benefit of a correction after the fact. So it may be useful to try to improve impressions of potential targets of disinformation when they're first introduced to the public. So again, that was the hypothesis I laid out at the beginning, and that's where I said, like, I think there's some evidence that that is a good idea. So just to summarize the broader points, so first of all, I think these mock candidate stimuli are a useful way to study misinformation, especially because you can get pure impression data based only on what's shown in the study, which is nice. It also doesn't require data sharing from social media platforms, which is nice because they're no longer interested in sharing that kind of data. So being able to study it in a mock paradigm is nice. A limitation, especially like in the aggregate, like the effect sizes, when you looked at the interactions, especially with the intervention conditions and the main effects, so when you put it together, it's kind of small and inconsistent effect sizes. Also, it's a pretty long paradigm, and you need large samples, so it ends up being pretty expensive to run, and there isn't as much money available to study this as there was a few years ago. So that's unfortunate. But both cognitive and socio-emotional inoculations seem beneficial for reducing impacts, at least of unverified accusations, on how people perceive their targets. So just one last interesting question in how you think about this, though. So do these uncorrected but not disproven accusations represent misinformation? So initially, I only was identifying the corrected accusations as being clear misinformation, because it's like they've been refuted, and so, yeah, the uncorrected accusations, maybe you should be validating them. But I presented this at a conference, got some good feedback, actually, from someone in this room, that actually the idea that the uncorrected accusations are still unverified. They're not explicitly refuted, but they are unverified. So I think it is useful to increase skepticism. So even where not every accusation, so because not every accusation can be fact-checked, the idea that people are more skeptical of uncorrected accusations is probably still a good thing. So, okay, so that's all I had. So yeah, I just want to thank my mentors and collaborators on this work. We got funding from Facebook. Again, not a thing that's happening anymore, but I do appreciate that, and I appreciate you all for listening as well.
Stay up there, please. Stay up there. We'll still need him. Thank you so much, Michael. So it was a super interesting presentation. Take a seat. We'll do questions. We have a few minutes left. Who wants to ask? Start here in the front. Can you just wait for the microphone? Sorry, she's coming.
Hi. So you started the conversation with a reference to Donald Trump, and I noticed that one of the things that he does is he doesn't wait for people to say that that didn't happen. He says it himself, right? And he kind of preempts any skepticism by saying that whoever's making these accusations against me, they're not credible. So I wonder if you think that denials would change this story, or like preemptive attacks on the credibility of people who would lie to ruin your reputation.
Well, wait, I think what Trump is doing is, and I think what you're saying is kind of the opposite. It's like there's true accusations, but if anything, he's throwing out the same accusation to like accusing other people of doing the same things that he actually did. And so then when people hear the accusation against him, they're like, oh, well, one side's throwing that at their side and one side's throwing it at their side, so I don't know what's going on. And like, so I feel like that's, but I mean, but I do think it is also kind of a type of inoculation, I guess. But yeah, that's where you sort of need to be able to judge what's the ground truth and what's not. Which again, as I think the last talk talked about, some like if people are really low trust, there aren't sources that everyone can rely on to give factual information. Like that makes it really hard.
Thanks a lot. Anyone else? We have a question here in the front.
In the studies, you looked at one claim against one person, but at Centers for Disease Control, we're dealing, or used to until a month ago, deal with many claims against one intervention. And I guess I'm wondering, in like the instance of vaccines, where we often saw people discount the first dozen vaccine misinformation claims, but they started reporting this notion of when there's smoke, there's fire. Like I've just heard so many claims now that I'm worried about it. Do you have a sense of whether or not social emotional inoculation might prevent something like that or address that?
I think it's a really interesting question. I mean, my guess is that the cognitive inoculations might be better because you're at least like, you're seeing those, as you keep getting those hits, like you're going to be more skeptical of each one, I think. Where the socio-emotional one is like, oh, you're pushing it in this direction, and then now you're more resistant to believing that they. But yeah, I think that mechanism where you keep getting hits, that might overwhelm the inoculation. But yeah, I don't know for sure. I think it's an interesting question. It actually probably wouldn't be that hard to study actually either. So something we could study in future work.
Thanks a lot. Do we have anyone in the back? I don't think. No, then we continue here.
Hi, thank you. Really fascinating presentation. There's been quite a lot of data about how people are sharing misinformation, disinformation, despite knowing that it is untrue, right? And what we're seeing at the moment is not just about falsehood spreading, it's actually the spreading of a whole ideological framework, right? One I would personally call fascist. So if people are sharing things for emotional reasons, because of whole ideological frameworks which bring together interpretations of history, false and true information into a whole way of understanding things, how can this play a role within a larger strategy to address this problem? Does this, it feels too small and limited in where it's going to make an impact on things like this. How would you respond to that? Sorry, it's not a more direct question.
No, I think this is something that I have thought a lot about, and I sometimes see this method, because I think you're right. And actually, Sander and I, in a paper that I co-authored with him, kind of had a brief debate back and forth about this. Like, do the January 6th people actually believe that the election was stolen, or was that just an excuse to go and raid the Capitol because they were angry? And I feel to me it seems unlikely that people actually believed it, although Sander said that he spoke with some people and they said that they actually did. So that's more first, so I think it's an interesting debate to have though. And but I do think misinformation is kind of the beginning of that pipeline. So I feel like you start out maybe low trust, a little more on the conservative side, and then you keep hearing that Democrats are evil or liberals are evil, even outside of the US context, and then you're willing to believe anything, and then it becomes so part of your identity, and the affective polarization is so high that then you're just looking for an excuse to take more extreme action. And so and I know, so Jay Van Bavel and others I think also have some interesting theories about the accuracy motivation and how it competes, the motivation to be accurate competes with other more social motivations. And I think when the affective polarization gets so high, which I think is initially brought on, not even necessarily by explicitly false information, but both false information and just misleading portrayals of true information, then you're kind of willing to take these more dramatic actions. And so yeah, so I'd love to, I haven't figured out yet exactly how to study that, but I would love to kind of get more at those multiple layers, because I think it is kind of a cycle.
Thanks a lot. So we do final question. Yeah.
So journalists know that when an error is made in a report, let's say you make a mistake about a company's earnings, and you make a correction, it's rarely seen. You have a controlled experiment. You know that the person has seen the correction, and yet you still don't see a complete reversal. Can you kind of comment on sort of?
Yeah, I think that's the problem. Obviously in the case where it's a mistake, you can't really do anything about it. But that's why, personally, I think content moderation is really important. I think trying to prevent this stuff from getting out there in the information ecosystem is really important. With ours at least, which is a little different, I think, than the scenario you're talking about, I do have a little bit of evidence, although not as much as I'd like, but at least the accusations are more emotionally evocative than the corrections are. And at least on memory testing later, it's you get a benefit for the accusations that doesn't hold up for the refutations. But I think you might also, so that impacts memory, but it also is potentially impacting other forms of processing where it's this dry kind of cognitive correction is just not hitting in as many levels in your brain basically as the really emotionally evocative accusation is. So I think that's part of it. But yeah, ultimately, again, this is why what Elon Musk has done with Twitter and what Facebook has now done the same thing basically of just throw off all the guardrails and no content moderation. It's that's the worst thing you can do, I think. And we really need to not be doing that if anyone actually cares about the information ecosystem.
Thanks a lot for that, Michael. Thanks for your presentation, the questions.